If it were not for electrical reactance formula, which describe an inference that we imply or infer, they suggest an inference that we cannot sense with our five senses. We cannot measure it, but we know it exists because it describes a situation we cannot measure, and we know from trial and error experience that these electrical reactance formulas are accurate. It is these very formulas of inductive reactance and capacitive reactance that are the demonstrable proof, a mathematical proof, for the non-limitation of creation. In other words, when energy flows from a larger quantity of energy into smaller subdivisions, as it distributes itself throughout the universe, as it moves and subdivides into smaller and smaller quantities of energy into smaller and smaller spaces, there is this endless flow without a beginning and without an ending. Now, electrical reactance formula do not work on energy directly, but they have a consequence because they work on frequency, which is potential energy. And the net result will be an effect on kinetic energy. And depending on whether or not it's inductive reactance versus capacitive reactance will determine whether or not we're dealing with positive resistance or negative resistance. Positive resistance being in inductive reactance and negative resistance being in capacitive reactance. But capacitive reactance is not limited to capacitors alone. It also exists with among coils when their coupling coefficient, their magnetic coupling, is very low under certain circumstances. And that's a very intriguing situation in itself, but be that as it may. These inductive reactance formulas bypass any statement about conservation of energy. They simply take the energy that's already there, no matter how small it may be, so small maybe we can't even measure it, and through feedback loop of either a positive feedback or a negative feedback situation, that energy, no matter how big or small or anywhere in between, increases or diminishes its size. So it's not unlike the loaves and the fishes miracle that Christ performed when he didn't want to send away the multitudes who came to listen to his lecture, his Sermon on the Mount. He said, okay, bring me the loaves and fishes, and he magnified their quantity. He didn't create energy. He didn't create matter. He simply magnified it within a certain time domain that was a reasonable amount of time. They didn't have to wait too long for the event to occur because people were hungry, and they would leave if he didn't feed them right away and not listen to his Sermon on the Mount. So this expansion or contraction of energy as a secondary effect, not only does it not violate the conservation of energy law, but it disproves the fallacy of assuming that creation, or the universe, whatever you want to call it, has a limit of size, an upper boundary, and has a lower boundary of size of energy and matter, such as the quanta. The quanta minimum quantity of energy in which change will occur. It's all a fiction. And it's very interesting because if we assume the contrary, that the universe, the contrary to what I'm promoting here, the conventional presumption that the scale of the universe is bounded, it has an upper boundary and a lower boundary, then you're violating conservation of energy. You have to assume that energy is created and is destroyed, because energy doesn't just go from point A to point B. When energy moves, it subdivides. It has to. Now, it subdivides, sometimes it aggregates. Sometimes it goes in the reverse direction. But consider the possibility of what would happen if, we'll see now, I guess most physicists will say, well, we have the Big Bang because the energy aggregates, because it's limited, and then it's a singular item, and then the Big Bang occurs and it subdivides. And it goes through these alternating cycles of aggregation and subdivision. And this is how they explain the movement of energy. Interesting. Of course, they're assuming the universe is a closed system. But no such, nobody's, even within our limited domain, when we look at energy, we never look at closed systems. It doesn't exist. Every circuit has a field around it. And we know this. It has a field around the wire. It has an electric field and a magnetic field. There's no such thing as a closed system. The wire might serve as a waveguide of sorts, but and a point of concentration, but it's the density of energy moving away from that wire keeps getting less and less, like Zeno's paradox. It never goes away. It just keeps getting less and less. I can see where the problem lies. So the physicists assume that the breathing that I talk about is really the Big Bang. Energy aggregates and it subdivides, and it aggregates and subdivides in alternating cycles of accumulation and dissipation. While I'm presuming something different, that energy only flows in one direction, from a larger aggregation into smaller subdivisions. It's a one-way flow. And because of that, electrical reactance has to step in to make up the difference, because to modify the quantity of energy at any particular location or dimension of size, and to explain how the energy can increase or decrease without being created or destroyed. This is an interesting situation we have here. Which is the true reality? Well, okay, while they are assuming that matter is moving apart, what is it, the Doppler effect? But what's to presume that it'll come back together again? They're assuming too much. It's just a theory. They're assuming too much. It could be that nothing but the Doppler effect happens and it just keeps going on, because there is no limit to the size of the universe, so the energy keeps spreading out. This is interesting. So then capacitive reactance dominates the universe, not inductive reactance. And that sounds valid because the dielectric of empty space is a capacitive situation. So it stands to reason that energy is constantly increasing in the universe, because the size of the universe is constantly increasing as the energy dissipates and subdivides. To maintain the space between atoms, so to speak, so that we don't get this increasing densification of energy, and instead maintain a semblance of balance of empty space versus, in between, or separating atoms. So we don't even have to look at it in terms of scalability of size, upper boundary versus lower boundary of the universe. Instead, I see where the problem lies. That's right. They consider space to be a concrete object. It's not. It's an abstraction. It's an abstract potentiality which can only be defined in mathematics, just like electrical reactance can only be defined in mathematics. Yet it's significant that electrical reactance has material or concrete effects. While space, you can't really define it. You can't, because it's an abstract potentiality, which can be anything you want it to be, depending on what mathematical statement you want to cook up, you want to imagine. It can be anything you want to be, regardless of your imagination, with no limitation to our imagination, because it's not a concrete reality. Space, you could say space does not exist, but then we would be saying that mathematics does not exist. So it's not really a correct way to go about it. It sounds poetic, but it doesn't do it justice. So it's not poetic justice. It would be a lie to say that. It's just not a concrete reality. Space is a abstract reality. It's an abstraction that is more real than the concrete world because it's the cause, while the concrete world is the effect. What we see is the effect, while the cause cannot be seen, nor can it be measured. Okay, this is interesting. So that's where the fundamental flaw of physics is the idea that space is concrete and could have dimensions, it could have shape, how is, Einstein, how is space shaped? Well, it's curved like a saddle that you put on the backside of a horse and when you want to ride the horse. Or it's this shape, or it's that shape. It's not any shape, because it's not concrete. And this is a mistake by way of oversight. Because if you make it concrete, then it's a closed system, right? It has to be. And creation and conservation of energy has to be complied with, because you have a fixed quantity of energy, because you're assuming space is concrete. So already you put a boundary condition on our concrete world just by defining space as concrete. But if space is not concrete, if it's abstract, then there is no boundary condition to the concrete world, potentially speaking. And consequently, there's no boundary condition to energy or matter, potentially speaking. At any one point in time, maybe it is a specific quantity of energy and matter, but that's not to say it can't expand or contract willy-nilly because of electrical reactance. If energy equals matter, then electrical reactance tells us that matter can increase or decrease in quantity within the entire universe. So it's funny, we ignore electrical reactance as if it's a sidebar, when it's the most significant aspect of the mathematical quantification of electrodynamics, supported by two supporting themes. One we put all of our attention on, Ohm's law, and the other is the reciprocal of Ohm's law, which has to do with conductivity measured in Siemens. Ohm's law is measured in ohms, it measures resistance. But conductivity is measured in Siemens and is the reciprocal of Ohm's law, sometimes called Mohs law, but I believe there's another term. Electrical engineers didn't like Mohs law as an expression, as a verbal expression, so they came up with something else, and I can't remember what it was, because I didn't think it was very significant that they objected to Mohs law. And I think it's because they don't want it to be obvious that conductivity is the reciprocal inverse. In other words, that's a double negative. It's the reciprocal. In other words, it's the inverse relationship of Ohm's law, of resistance. Conductivity and resistance are reciprocal relationships, so that when you're dealing with resistance versus conductivity, it really bypasses any consideration whatsoever of, oh, by the way, are we dealing with temperature? Because it doesn't matter at that point. Temperature is irrelevant. It's only relevant when you're dealing with either Ohm's law or Mohs law, but neither both as a generic overview. In other words, with resistance, it's going to matter because the only way you get more resistance is to increase the temperature. And with Mohs law, the only way you're going to increase conductivity is to lower the temperature. We assume. And we assume that based on Ohm's law perspective. But when we look at things from Mohs law perspective, it changes everything. Because now we can have superconductivity at room temperature, at any temperature, because we're using a different methodology to go about the amplification of conductivity, and it has nothing to do with temperature. For instance, give you an example. Pressure. If you pressurize a capacitor while it is under operation, you increase its negative resistance. Every capacitor has an equivalent series resistance of a certain amount based on the materials of its construction and how much pressure it is undergoing. And if you increase the pressure of that capacitor, you do strain it. You do shorten its lifespan, but you also increase its negative resistance, which means it becomes a generator of energy, in the sense that whatever energy goes in gets magnified. You're not creating energy. You're magnifying it per unit time. See, so this is the other problem. Nobody looks at time as the intrinsic feature to energy. So they always assume that it's like a log, which is merely a storehouse of energy. It has nothing to do with how quickly do you burn it. Nobody bothers to consider that. They don't care. Well, it's still the same amount of energy regardless of whether you burn it quicker or slower. But energy in a circuit is never spent. You always return it to the source, right? So it's simply going around in a circle. And we just assume that it can be spent when all we are doing is equalizing our two voltages, which were different in the beginning, and then the flow of current is because it wants to equalize the two areas. But it is possible to create a condition in a circuit in which the current flows in opposite direction, and that's called negative unity power factor, in which instead of the current equalizing the voltage, it makes it more extreme, so that the voltage drops where the current is coming from to the point of zero, and the voltage amasses and accumulates at the area where the current is going towards. And this can happen when voltage is inverted. The polarity of voltage is inverted by a full half cycle of 180 degrees per AC cycle. Most electrical engineers never consider that a viable option to artificially create in a circuit so that normal statements about reality are irrelevant. They don't describe the reality. Conservation of energy is assuming energy is a concrete reality, but it's not. Because electrical reactance is based on time alone, not on the energy that's there. It'll act on the energy that's there as a side effect, but it doesn't act on kinetic energy. It acts on potential energy, frequency, having an impact on kinetic energy as a side effect, a very significant side effect. So the domain or the consideration of electrical reactance is strictly in terms of time. Namely, you use phase difference between current and voltage of a whole half cycle to create a condition in which you can operate under electrical reactance instead of worrying about Ohm's law and then or Mohs law or something that's a law when it's no longer a law, because now you don't have a fixed amount of energy anymore. It either diminishes or increases because now all you deal with is time. And as an effect, frequency as an effect to the causation, which was the splitting of the atom? No, the splitting of power. Interesting analogy. We're so busy smashing atoms or fusing or fissioning in order to, divide the atom. That's right. Atomic, wow. What was the word I just used? Atomic separation? Atomic division? No, I said something, I forgot what it was. But we do that between current and voltage. Yeah, splitting the atom. We do that when we split wattage, because wattage is zero phase difference between voltage and current. They're in sync in time. But when we split them to their maximum value of 180 degrees, and which nobody talks about. They always talk about halfway there, 90 degrees. But when we go all the way, a funny thing happens. Now the energy can either increase or decrease at will. So we have several blind spots in physics as it politically dominates electrical engineering perspective. We view space as a concrete reality by saying, oh, well, I wonder what the dimensions of space are. I wonder what the shape of space is, when space doesn't have any shape and it doesn't have any dimensions. It's an abstract potentiality which can only be expressed in mathematics, but there are no limiting factors as to what you can express about space. It can be anything you want it to be, which is what electrical reactance provides for. It provides for anything you want it to be. Even though electrical reactance is a definitive expression in mathematics, there are things left out of electrical reactance formula. Namely, is it positive resistance versus negative resistance? Yet when I went into Paul Falstad's Java code to modify the mathematical simulatable formula for simulating the behavior of a transformer pair of coils, I discovered that the only way to insert resistance, equivalent series resistance of coils, was to realize that capacitors, in order to put them into capacitors, it becomes negative resistance. Versus if you put them into the coils of a transformer, it becomes positive resistance. That's the only realization I could make, because it's different places in each instance. It's not the same kind of place. It's not the same exact place, but it's the same kind of place. And the consequence is you begin to have this flipped view of coils versus capacitors, in which coils suck up energy and make it go away, seemingly, versus capacitors, which seemingly manifest energy out of nowhere. And then you have to explain, well, what's going on? And electrical reactance formula already explained this, except they don't concern themselves with space or quantity or amplitude of energy, watts, power. They only concern themselves with frequency of power. Now, we always assume that frequency and amplitude are inversely related, but that's Ohm's law. That's positive resistance. In Mohs law, conductivity, they are directly related. And this is where electrical reactance kicks in, because we can either diminish the energy or the kinetic energy or increase the kinetic energy by diminishing the frequency or increasing the frequency. In other words, there's a direct relationship. See, Ohm's law satisfies conservation of energy, but Mohs law does not. Mohs law undermines conservation of energy big time, because conservation of energy assumes energy is fixed because it assumes space is fixed. It has limits. Energy doesn't have limits any more than space does, because time has no limits. What kind of limit can you impose on frequency? You can't. And that's potential energy. So how can anybody even assume that kinetic energy has limits of either smallest size versus the largest size? There are no limits to kinetic energy, just as there are no limits to matter, which is equivalent to energy. Duh. It's not that hard to reason out of the pea soup mess that physics has gotten ourselves into, to conform to the corporate mindset that you have to pay for the energy that you consume, instead of having all the energy you want for any purpose. Now, granted, that could be dangerous, because you could blow up the planet, right? But easily enough with a chain reaction situation. China Syndrome, Michael Douglas and Jane Fonda, you could easily do that, and it doesn't have to be nuclear physics to do it. It can be electrical dynamic theory that can do it just as easily, because all the um, the valence shells of an electron of the valence shell of electron the electron valence shells of copper atoms is how much wiggle room you can increase or decrease the energy that the copper wire is carrying without destroying the wire. But what if you start pumping in more energy than what the valence shell electrons can accommodate you? Now you're getting into the lower level orbitals of the copper atom that's going to destroy the ability for that copper atom to hold together. The atom alone. We're not even talking about the atoms being held to each other so that the wire holds together. That's actually the energy value of the valence shells that will determine how well the copper wire holds together. So you've already violated the copper wire and blown that to smithereens before we even consider whether or not the copper atom itself can remain a solid copper atom. Because if you take away all the electrons, all of them, from a copper atom, you're left with a nucleus, right? That sounds like you're already veering into the nuclear physicist's realm, and yet you did it strictly by electrodynamics. See, there are different ways of cutting a chunk of cheese, you know. You don't have to cut it always the same way that everybody tells you got to slice it. You can slice the cheese any way you like and still get the similar results. Interesting. I knew this as a child, but, you know, how do you talk to grown-ups that way? Like, no, you're talking off your noodle. There are only three things to consider: the situation, the goal you want to reach, and the method you want to get there. And you can change, you can impose a limit by imposing a fixed condition of any two of those three and make up the difference with the third. Doesn't matter which one, which way you want to arrange it. So if you want to give yourself wiggle room by the methodology, fine. You can accommodate any situation that you're forced into accepting, and any goal that you have to reach just by changing your method. Or, if you prefer, you can have a fixed method you're stuck with, and a fixed goal you have to reach, and change any condition, accommodate any condition you want. It's possible. Or you can have a fixed condition and a fixed method to reach a goal, and reach any goal you want. It sounds absurd, I know. But you have to understand that you have to give, you know, it takes the mind of a yogi to be able to think this way, because you will not be hampered by conditioned thinking. This is what Charlie Lutz kept saying over and over again. We have to get out of conditioned thinking. You know, the hardest habit pattern to break is a mental one. Not a physical one, not an emotional one, but a mental one. Because a mental habit pattern will determine our emotional habits and our physical habits. And if you change a mental habit, you change everything else. But changing a mental habit can be very difficult. It's the most difficult habit to change. And the only easy way to change it is samadhi, to transcend. It's really, in today's world, you have to have yoga to survive. You have to be able to experience samadhi to survive. Otherwise, you're going to keep making the same mistakes, get the same results, and no way to liberate yourself from prior experience. The cycles of repeating prior experiences. You know, habit patterns have very deep groove depending on how lengthy a duration that habit pattern had lasted, which makes it all the more difficult to change them. But it doesn't mean it's impossible. It just makes it more difficult. So most people operate out of ignorance, not knowing that it is possible to accelerate and make it easier to change. And oddly enough, Charlie Lutz predicted that change is going to accelerate in our society. It's going to continue to accelerate. The rate of change is going to continue to accelerate to such a degree that it will take intuition to keep up and survive. You won't be able to rely on experience, memory, authority figures, scripture, tradition. None of that will help you to survive. You're going to have to use intuition to survive. Because it's going to be such a fast-paced world of change, not merely of activity, but of change of how activity is conducted. We're going to have a hard time keeping up. Children will be born who will have a much easier facility because they will understand this. And their parents are going to go gaga. Just go, I can't handle all these changes. Aren't we already? It's going to get worse. It's not going to get any better. And that indicates the frequency is increasing, right? The frequency is increasing. That's right. There was one increase in February of 1986. It was very marked because the ultraviolet radiation went up by a sizable amount, reaching us. But that's not the only avenue of increasing our consciousness, our conscious frequency. There are other avenues. Oh boy. We have a lot of limitations still, conservative viewpoints, and they're based on rocks. Maharishi used to say that stress is really a situation of how unreadily we adapt to a changing situation. So he likened it to stroking a finger through rock. You know, you got to use a chisel and a hammer to do that, right? And the rock is the mind of habit pattern. And the finger trying to pass through it is the finger of change. Well, what if instead of rock we have sand? Not so bad. What if instead of sand we have water? What if instead of water we have air? And each situation becomes easier and easier for the medium to accommodate the movement of that finger through that medium. Whether it's a rock or a sand or water or air, it gets easier and easier to accommodate change. And stress is really an indication of it's going to happen anyway. You're going to get stressed anyway. You can't avoid it. So the real problem is, how long does that stress linger? In the case of the rock, boy, you can see that groove that somebody etched in the stone. You know, Michelangelo's David is still sitting there, you know, in Italy, in which he cut out David from a hunk of rock. But when was the last time you played with your hand in the swimming pool, you know, moving it around, and the water moves, and then it quickly dies out? And that's the measuring rod, the measuring stick as to how well you're doing in your progress in meditation is how quickly do you get over change? How quickly, or how long does it take for the stress to disappear? You know, if it takes a long time, then you still got to work on on raising your consciousness and stabilizing that by alternating between raising your consciousness in meditation and then going into activity. And then automatically the physiology stabilizes, or integrates, I should say, a higher vibratory rate of your consciousness, along with whatever state of consciousness you find yourself in, waking, dreaming, or sleeping. It's not something you can force. You know, your stabilization of higher consciousness cannot be forced. It's not something you can control. It's really the nervous system that controls it. You can pursue, well, pretty much so. All you can do is alternate between samadhi and non-samadhi and go back and forth. And so one experience of samadhi doesn't do it. You know, they say that of the Buddha or whatever, you know, you should be so lucky. Most of us, we have to go repeated experiences over and over again of samadhi before it finally establishes itself. And it can take more than one lifetime. That's how long it can take sometimes, because some of us start out in a very gross place, and we have a long ways to go to refine our consciousness. Okay, so we started with physics, the limitations of physics that it imposes by certain presumptions, and we ended up with samadhi, so and the life of a meditator. But there's really no other way to talk about the limitations of physics except to end up talking about yoga, because something is got to give if we're going to end up with free energy, and it's really our consciousness that is failing to give. We got to stick to the old ways of thinking. That sounds like Fiddler on the Roof. You know the movie Fiddler on the Roof? And the Fiddler on the Roof was made at a time when marriages, who gets married, was starting to loosen and weaken. No, it's got to be a man, it's got to be a woman, it's got to be from the same religion. Well, my parents were not from the same religion. So there's a transition right there. And oh boy, did their grandparents fight it. Oh, it won't work. Well, it's true, it didn't work. It only lasted 10 years. And you know what blew my parents' marriage? It wasn't their difference of religion. It was their difference of diet. And my grandmother expressed that at the very beginning. When she found out that her daughter was going to marry a non-Jew, she said, it could be worse. It could be... Well, it is worse. Guess what, Mom? Oh? He's a vegetarian. Hoi gewalt! She could handle a non-Jew, but a vegetarian, out of the question. Because, my mother's parents were conservative Jews. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, maintained a kosher kitchen. And she couldn't imagine vegetarian. It's like, that throws kosher right out the window. It's like, it's totally not relevant. Because you're not eating animals, so who cares if you're mixing meat with milk? Or how you killed the animal to get your meat. Because you didn't kill an animal, you just cut off the head of broccoli, and it screamed at you, but it was a head of broccoli, and the kashrut laws don't apply. They don't talk about cutting off the heads of broccoli. How to do it in a sane manner, in a painless manner. You could care less. You just cut off the head of broccoli and you eat it. Who cares? You see, that's how you... Here, I will end with an example of that to illustrate that. The Gordian knot was a famous knot that nobody could untie. And Alexander of Macedonia stepped up to it with his sword. He cleaved that Gordian knot with his sword and said, "So much for that problem." I love it. Oh, one more illustration. That it points out there are two different ways of change. And Charlie said, well, it's always better to apply something new layered on top of something old. In other words, to insert the new into the old. That's evolution. But sometimes, unfortunately, things don't work out that way. You're forced into a revolutionary situation in which the current situation has to be completely swept aside, and you have to start all over again from scratch in order to create the new reality. Because the old reality is fighting it too much. And maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need the breakdown of society and social services and whatnot to such a complete degree in our corporate world, which is trying to maintain its stability at all costs. Maybe all that has to be swept aside. That would be unfortunate, but it might be true. It might be true. Well, let's pray that it doesn't happen, or that it doesn't happen too severely. Maybe that's all we can do, is lessen its severity at this point, because maybe it has to happen. It's not a question of trying to protect yourself, hoping to be in the right place at the right time. It's really a question of collective consciousness. That's the only way you can provide for reducing, the severity of revolution, is by trying to improve collective consciousness, by contributing to it, by being yourself that improvement. That's really the only way to do it, because you're going to get sucked up by the flow of everything happening around you anyway. So how can you possibly imagine that, I will find some safe little place to hide myself away from the din of humanity and thus safeguard my extinction when the revolution happens? Come on. Nothing's isolated anymore. Everything's interconnected. But see, how many people think that way? Okay, I better shut up now. I'll talk forever if I don't shut up.